fact that the 10 or 20% of it was basically going to be lost. I'm thinking of that in the early future. But this question is being posed, to the question that sort of entirely the opinions, Jeff is going to.
I think he did question that earlier. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Stimson Center on this beautiful, cool summer day compared to the last couple of weeks. We have a good crowd for a late afternoon event. Thank you all for coming here today. My name is Link Bloomfield, and I won't try to repeat my current title because it conjures up being carved into the lid of a sarcophagus somewhere in a dusty museum. So I'm alive and kicking and happy to be back. And if I may say so, it's good to see the Stimson Center doing so well. A little bit of an ad, the center is really thriving today under the leadership of Brian Finley and the chairmanship of David Lane. Among the nation's leading think tanks, there is no think tank that does so much, that has so much impact internationally and such a reputation around the world for its size. There's no comparison, no peer. So very proud to come and see how well everything is going here. And I'm here to introduce a very interesting panel about Stimson's newest publication, Mekong Power Shift, Emerging Threats, Emerging Trends in the Greater Mekong Subregion's Power Sector. This publication continues a program that was begun by our distinguished senior fellow, Dr. Richard Cronin, and has contributed to good, solid policy development in Washington and in Southeast Asia for 7 years now. And today we're going to hear from the report's principal author, Courtney Weatherby, and Brian Eiler, the director of Stimson's Southeast Asia program, and we're very pleased to welcome Mr. Vikram Sequeira from the State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. Welcome. Great to have you here. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Rich Cronin. Stimson's Southeast Asia program is actively engaged in developing workable policy alternatives to otherwise unsustainable plans for hydropower development in the Mekong Basin. Policymakers in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam have acted on this program's policy recommendations and have expressed their interest in further engagement on system-wide, system-scale water and energy planning. Brian and Courtney are leading the newly formed Mekong Basin Connect program involving several external and local players to increase local capacity and promote all-of-government approaches towards the Mekong's development challenges. This publication is the fourth in the team's Letters from the Mekong series, and this is a series that Dr. Cronin began a few years ago. It's the first publication for which Courtney Weatherby is the principal author. Brian is just back from the region. I don't know if Courtney was also on the trip, so they have very fresh insights to share, and we look forward to what they have to say today. So again, thank you all for coming, and let me turn the proceedings over to Dr. Rich Cronin. Rich?
Thank you. Thank you. Push button here first.
Thank you, Link, and welcome, everyone. This, for me, a very satisfying moment in terms of the publication of this current latest report, the fourth in this series of so-called Letters from the Mekong that we've done. And I thought, before I get out of the way and let the panelists do their thing, that just a little context to what's been happening over the last 10 years, a little less maybe, that we've been working on this, well, we call it our Mekong Policy Project. And it got started in around 2007 or so in terms of my latching onto this issue because of the threat posed by China's massive construction of massive cascade of mega dams in Yunnan province and their impact downstream, which was not only to affect the flow of the river and sediment and all those things, but also it became the enabler of lower Mekong dams, up to 9 now proposed by Laos and Cambodia, going back to, they were proposed in 2006, notified to the Mekong River Commission and their neighbors, and those, and because China has had multi cubic kilometers of water stored behind those dams. And now they started, they were going to build 8, then they got rid of 1 for some practical reasons, And they've completed 6, and the seventh is still up in the air. But the main point is that because they could store all this water and release it during the dry season, to keep their turbines running, the assumption was that this would then provide water during the dry season to keep these lower Mekong dams economically viable, operating, in other words. And so originally we did the thing that everybody does when they first look at these issues is basically we looked at the geopolitics and the economic drivers and the environmental impact and all that. But essentially we had this idea of we're going to bring science to policy making. So only if the leaders had better understood the science and the impact, that they would make more wiser decisions. Hopefully not even to build these mainstream dams, which are, they affect, up to like $9 billion annually of wild, mainly long-distance spawning fish, food fish, sediment that's needed to keep agriculture sustained in the region. The soil of the Lower Mekong is a laterite soil that doesn't have much nutrient. It doesn't have many nutrients in it, and so the annual flood and the sediment, the deposits are essential downstream. And then, of course, the sediment has to get to the Mekong Delta, and every dam traps sediment that should be headed that direction. So to cut this short, though, initially we thought about ways to approach this problem, and then we came to the realization that the economic drivers were so strong, we had to find some way to address these. And basically our goal became trying to promote sustainable trade-offs among energy, water, food security, and environment and livelihoods on a lower Mekong basin scale, because it was not only the 9 Lao dams planned for the mainstream and also 2 really bad Cambodian dams in terms of how much, how devastating it would be to fisheries sediment flows. That how do we promote something more of sustainable trade-offs? And we ended up realizing that first we learned over several years of research, and always from visits to the region, multiple visits to the region, even in 1 year, interviews and site visits to projects, that these were not all going to be built because there were rising political and financial risks to these very long-term development projects. Because they're all concessions. They're all concessional projects by investors, developer investors. And the first big signal was the suspension of the Myitsone Dam in Myanmar after the military government stepped down. And the Chinese still have like $1.2 billion investment tied up in that project. It's not going anywhere right now. So, but then also there were changes in energy markets, and they continue to change. And the cost of solar wind power, for instance, is going down. And we lit on the idea that if, for instance, Laos had a national electric power grid, it could get more power, including mainly for export, from fewer dams, and also that grid would support then backup power for solar and wind. And so since then, we've only moved more in the direction of looking at energy from a more holistic point of view, and particularly because it's not just hydropower dams, but Cambodia and Thailand and even Vietnam have coal in their future in terms of their long-term planning. So it's not just hydro, but there's this huge threat of more coal in Myanmar as well. So that came around eventually to what Brian and Courtney and Vikram are going to talk about today, which is look at this issue from a more holistic and comprehensive way, talking about energy, not just hydropower dams or other dirty sources like coal. That's a good place to start. Thank you.
I'll kick off the discussion of our publication. And thanks, Rich, and thanks, Link, for the introduction. great to see everyone here today. Courtney and I take many trips to the region, and Rich as well in the past. And I think those trips have helped us develop some guiding concepts that are important to policymakers in helping and shaping ways to think about the future of energy and water, and the intersection of energy and water within the greater Mekong subregion. So today we're going to talk about the greater Mekong subregion. That is China's Yunnan and Guangxi province, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam.
All right, back up. Start over.
And some of those guiding principles, well, one is this idea of the new narrative on Mekong hydropower development. And this came out of past trips and talks with Laos Ministry of Energy and Mines and looking at the data and discovering that the rate of MOUs for signing up and concession agreements, signing off on concession agreements for the more than 140 dams that are scheduled for Laos or that exist in Laos inventory, the rate of MOU and concession agreement signing is actually slowing down. So this is something that pushes back against the dominant narrative of the domino theory, that the next big dam is coming, and how do we prepare for the next dam? And it counters some of the prevailing notions that if the rates, well, that we're walking into a very dire situation. The reality is that there's still time. There's still time with ways to go about more sustainable, more strategic ways of planning out the future of the basin. And this is what helped inform our last publication called A Call for System-Scale Energy Planning in Laos. To stop thinking about what is the next dam on the river and considering that perhaps if not all these dams in Laos and in Cambodia as well are going to be built, then is there a way to go about building them in a strategic way that reduces impacts downstream and more importantly can take some of those dams off the map and replace them with other forms of energy generation, like solar, like wind. And we can't throw coal and other forms of fossil fuel power generation out of the mix either. So perhaps there's a more sustainable way to go about a more long-term and better thought-out plan to the basin. And again, in our trips, we also come across with some observations of some trends and some realizations that a lot is changing in this region. Laos is a country that wants to be the battery of Asia. But I'm going to go to this next slide here, and this shows China's Yunnan province. The blue is the total amount of installed hydropower capacity currently. The blue is the rest of the Mekong region. If you add the rest of the Mekong region up, it doesn't come close to China. And much of this hydropower is already in excess capacity, meaning it's not being used. It's not being sold into China's grid. It's just sitting there. So we think that sooner or later, this power there'll be a way for China to get this power into Southeast Asia. This is one of our recent realizations. Among other emerging trends, Myanmar as well could have the potential to turn into another battery of Southeast Asia, and potentially through the export of hydropower and other forms of power generation inside of Myanmar eclipse what a country like Laos can do. So the idea of Laos being a battery of Southeast Asia is one that I feel is up for contention. And this really drives a thumb in the eye of the plans of the Lao government to kind of be the only game in town. There's going to be many games in town. We also had other realizations while we were watching the price of solar and wind drop worldwide and thinking about how this might impact the region and how this might allow for greater competition of non-hydropower renewables to, again, compete with the traditional planning process that is going about in Southeast Asia, one that favors coal and hydropower. At the same time, conservation movements are on the rise within the region, and this impacts where dams are placed, where coal-fired power plants are placed. Think about the Krabi coal-fired plant that Prime Minister Prayut suspended and put on hold for a few years until the environmental impact assessments were complete. These movements are making a difference and they're responding to coal and hydropower plants directly. And at the same time, there are emerging trends in decentralized power distribution as well as high voltage transmission that can send power from generation centers far away from the load centers, thousands of kilometers away, in a very efficient and inexpensive manner. So with these emerging trends, and Courtney's going to talk more deeply about them, our general thought was, well, perhaps these states should wait. These countries should wait. Because a dam that, say, Cambodia signs up for today or Laos signs off on today is going to take 7 to 10 years to come into operation. And essentially, we're talking about already obsolete technology once that dam comes into operation. If we look at the long-term trends and prospects for other forms of energy generation, coupled with energy storage innovation that should be rolling out into the future. So it's a good time to take a pause. Not saying, our message is not for countries in the Mekong subregion to stop power sector planning, but again, to pause, take a look at these emerging trends, and to think about how, in ways that Rich was talking about, through like power grid and transmission, regional power trade and transmission mechanisms, the region can do more with less and more with less damaging power infrastructure. That's the general overview. I'm going to turn it over to Courtney to get a little bit deeper into the weeds on these emerging trends.
Thank you, Brian. So as Brian introduced, one of the first trends that we want to talk about is a shift in the region. Which countries are net power importers, which countries are net power exporters, and how this may change in both the near and the far term. So we're going to start with the exporting countries, and I'm going to try and run through these energy profiles relatively quickly. There's a lot of detail on the 2-page profiles for each country in the report, and people are welcome to ask questions about that afterwards. So Laos is the first. As Brian mentioned, it wants to be the battery of Southeast Asia. It has already been a net power exporter for a very long time, and this is going to continue in the future. The major shift is going to be the amount and potentially the type of power that Laos is exporting. If you look at the current electricity mix for Laos, it's dominated almost 75% by hydropower, mostly large-scale hydropower. And a smaller percentage, about 28%, is coal, coming from one large coal plant that was just constructed last year. If you look at the potential resources that Laos has, they are somewhat more diversified. It has approximately 18 gigawatts of potential hydropower, some of which has already been built out, but the majority of which is still in the pipeline. It's got about 9 gigawatts of solar potential, which there are just a few pilot projects that have started in recent years, so that's still very early for Laos. It has almost 3 gigawatts of wind potential and has some geothermal reserves. It's important to note here as well that it does not have coal reserves, so any coal for the Hongsa lignite power plant that's on this chart and any future coal plants that are in the pipeline is going to be imported, so it's not a domestic resource for Laos. And as Brian mentioned and Rich mentioned, there are many dams planned for this region. Laos alone has more than 140 in the pipeline. And when you look at their future energy plans, it's not so much a comprehensive energy plan as it is simply a list of projects that they have available for investors. And this is largely due to the fact that they don't have the financial capacity to build these projects themselves. And so projects moving forward, the energy sector moving forward in Laos is almost entirely dependent on outside investor interests driving the process forward. Keeping all that in mind, Laos is building almost all of this for export, including any future solar or wind capacity. Continuing on to our other potential export countries, I'm not going to spend too much time on China. That could be a panel and a report all on its own. And as Brian already touched on, the most important factor in China for Southeast Asia is the excess hydropower capacity that currently exists in Yunnan province. He showed you the chart before to show that the installed capacity is already far more than what we have available in Southeast Asia. This is extremely important because these projects are already built. They've been controversial, they've been criticized, but they're already existent. And so as Brian said, there is the potential, as China is interested in exporting this power, they don't want to continue losing money on the 95 terawatt hours of electricity that was wasted last year because there was no one to sell it to in China due to political economy issues with the coal sector. They want to export this to other markets, and the nearest market, apart from Guangzhou, is Southeast Asia or potentially Bangladesh. So people are interested in this. They're looking at the potential for building the infrastructure. So China is likely in the short to medium term to come online as a net power exporter in the greater Mekong subregion. Brian also already touched briefly on Myanmar's situation. As probably almost everyone in this room knows, Myanmar is coming from a difficult starting point. They have very low installed capacity, but they have very rich resources. So they have approximately 4,500 megawatts currently installed in Myanmar. They have about 100,000 megawatts of potential hydropower, significant solar, and also some oil and gas, natural gas reserves off the coast. In the past, the natural gas and oil have been exported, so Myanmar has been a net exporter in the past. But in the future, given extremely high demand growth, it was about 15% annually in recent years, and this is likely to continue into the future. Most future electricity capacity in the near term will be for the domestic audience. However, the sheer wealth of resources in Myanmar means that if they move forward with many of the projects that have been proposed, which is questionable given that a number of the hydropower and coal projects are controversial, but if they move forward with even half of them, they will likely have excess capacity. And they are ideally situated to export to demand centers in Bangkok and Thailand, or potentially to South Asia as well. So in the long term, Myanmar may have more of a role to play as a power exporter than a power importer.
Battery of Southeast Asia and South Asia,
potentially. Cambodia is sort of the final potential export country on our list here. And similar to Myanmar, Cambodia's existing installed capacity is very low. It's only about 1,500 megawatts. They currently import a significant amount from Vietnam and pay very high prices because much of the installed capacity, if you look at the chart off to the right here, it's hydropower, which is domestic, but imports make up almost 20%. And much of that is expensive imported diesel fuel, and some of it is coal to run coal plants. So the price per kilowatt hour in Cambodia is among the highest in ASEAN. It's more than what we pay here, around 24 cents per kilowatt hour in urban areas, much higher than that, sometimes up to 80 cents per kilowatt hour in rural areas. So it's a priority to build out the domestic capacity in Myanmar for the government. And they do have many resources. As Rich already mentioned, Cambodia is planning dams on the mainstream of the Mekong as well as tributary projects. So hydropower potential is about 10,000 megawatts. But it's extremely important to note that Cambodia also has very rich solar and wind potential. So estimates look at around, I think, 8 gigawatts of solar potential and 6.5 gigawatts of wind potential, much of which would be offshore. So currently, Cambodia has not begun to explore the potential for integrating renewables, but there are significant potential opportunities here in the near term, particularly as the price continues to drop and investors come in and can bring technical and human capacity. And particularly important for Cambodia is the fact that even if they don't build out most of the hydropower projects, the wet-dry season means that if they build out the rest of their capacity during the wet season, Cambodia has the potential to be an exporter, because when you've got all of the hydropower projects running at full steam ahead during the wet season, they'll likely have excess so they can export back to Vietnam. Shifting tack, we're going to now look at Thailand and Vietnam, which are the two countries that are already net power importers, and this is likely to continue and actually deepen and extend in the future. So Thailand stands out in Southeast Asia as the country with the largest installed capacity of almost 40,000 megawatts. At the same time, despite being middle income, relatively developed compared to its neighbors, the Electrical Generating Authority of Thailand, or EGAT, estimates that this installed capacity will need to double by 2036 in order to meet increasing demand, particularly in non-Bangkok areas of the country, as other areas urbanize and living standards raise. The future energy plans, if you look at the charts here, you can see that they are characterized by diversification. Thailand's electricity mix is currently a little over around 64% natural gas. Some of this is domestic. Much of it is imported from Myanmar. Given that Myanmar's future natural gas reserves will likely be exploited for domestic use, there are a lot of concerns about the supply coming from Myanmar, and Thailand's own reserves are drawing down. And so there's a significant priority among energy policy planners in the country to diversify away from this. So if you look at the chart, you'll see that coal is likely to increase, renewables are likely to increase, and Thailand aims to introduce nuclear power into the grid by 2036. At the same time, it's very important to note that there's significant opportunity to reduce the overall additional capacity that Thailand needs in the future. EGAT has a history of overestimating the energy demand needs. So if the energy modeling and forecasting is improved for accuracy, then it's likely this would be toned down somewhat. There's also significant opportunity to reduce the reserve capacity. EGAT currently has approximately 40% reserve capacity. So on top of 100% of the peak energy demand, there's an additional 40% that is intended to be spinning reserve at all times. This is significantly higher than the international standard, which is usually between 15 and 20%. So through improved planning and potentially improved energy infrastructure and reliability, Thailand could potentially shave off that extra 20% that's currently in its plans. And finally, there are significant opportunities for energy efficiency implementation. If anyone's been to Bangkok, you've probably seen how they tend to air condition the outdoors of all of the big malls in Bangkok. So better insulation, different building codes, and basic energy efficiency measures could help reduce this further. So while Thailand will continue to be a net importer no matter what happens, there is significant scope for reduction in the amount of power that Thailand might import in the long run, depending on how these policies play out.
In fact, that reduction is actually more than the plans for current dams on the Mekong. So just Thailand making a shift could reduce the hydropower impact in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. And one other note about Thailand actually is that much of this new power, they don't split it out into imports as some of the other countries' power development plans do. Much of this will actually be imported power from Myanmar and Laos if current plans move ahead. So Thailand, by shaving off some of that demand, might not need to invest in some of those dams like the Sheaburi on the mainstream of the Mekong. And finally, I want to quickly go through the energy profile for Vietnam. Vietnam has potentially the largest role to play in the energy sector in mainland Southeast Asia. And the reason for that is simple. They are adding, if you set aside China, they are adding the most capacity, far more capacity than any of the other mainland Southeast Asia countries. Currently installed capacity in Vietnam is a little over 33,000 megawatts. They have sustained high annual energy demand growth rates. It's been in the double digits for the better part of the last decade, and it's continued to slowly drop from 11% per annum down to 7% through 2030, and then will continue around 7 to 5% for the next few years. So all of that means that they're going to be more than tripling the installed capacity in order to meet electricity demand through 2030, which is not, it's 13 years from now. It's not that far. And you can see here that there is going to be, in addition to just expanding everything, a shift in the type of power that Vietnam depends on. Currently, the largest percentage of their energy mix is hydropower. Vietnam is tapped out for domestic hydropower resources, so apart from upgrading some of the existing plants, they're not going to be adding much capacity. So when you look at the actual percentages, you see the drop in hydropower and you see the rise in percentage that coal supply and that renewables will supply. There's actually very significant amounts because hydropower, the amount of hydropower is not changing. They are also planning to add, or have previously been planning to add, nuclear. Now, there are a few questions about Vietnam's energy plans. The first is that nuclear has now been put off the table. They had plans to have it provide, I think, 3.5% of the total power by 2030, so not an insignificant amount of 130,000 megawatts. For safety reasons and potential questions over the economic viability of nuclear power during that time frame, the National Assembly and Ministry of Energy have taken that off the table. So it's not very clear at this point what that percentage will be replaced with. Will it be additional renewables? Will it be additional imports? Will it be coal? Nobody's clear. That hasn't been announced. The other major uncertainty is the actual amount of power that Vietnam plans to import. Currently, they have a spot market agreement for trade with China. They have MOUs with Cambodia and with Laos. With Laos, it's an import. With Cambodia, it's an export. But notably, the total power that they plan to import under the Power Development Plan is only 1.5%, or a couple thousand megawatts. But the existing MOU just with Laos is for up to 5,000 megawatts by 2030. So there is clearly significant scope to expand the role that imports play, which, from just a trading perspective may not make sense, but when you consider the very serious economic impacts of building bad hydropower in the mainstream, Vietnam could potentially use its bargaining power as a purchaser to help determine which projects go ahead. So there could actually be an economic argument made to import more hydropower or more solar power or wind power from Laos as an alternative for Vietnam that would play well in the long run. So shifting from the regional profiles, I want to talk about sort of the second major trend that Brian had mentioned, which is the significant price drop in renewables. From 2009 to 2016, solar price globally dropped approximately 80%, wind dropped around 60%, and importantly, a great deal of that was just in the last couple of years. Between 2015 and 2016, both dropped 10% just in that 1 year alone. And you can see some of this reflected in the chart on the upper right here. Each of those circles on the chart is a power purchase agreement signed here in the United States for a solar or a wind plant, and they're coded by region, but you can clearly see the drop in price during that time. And so that most new projects are now coming in around $50 a megawatt hour, which puts them in some areas competitive. Wind in particular in the Midwest and areas of Texas is extremely competitive now when you compare to the price of other fossil fuels and other sources. This is also extremely important. This timing is important because many of the power development plans for countries in the region were being done in 2015 or early 2016 and did not account for these price drops. The information on this has come out since most of these power development plans were finalized. So when you look at the economic calculus for what each country is investing in, many of them had overestimated the likely price of solar, both in the near term, but down the road as well, because many analysts predict that these prices will probably drop another 25% through the early 2020s. So as a result, many of these are competitive on an economic scale. And this chart here, and the example I gave before about wind, was in the United States, but this is on the global scale. There were record prices that in Chile and Abu Dhabi for under 3 US cents per kilowatt hour, which is far cheaper than almost any other source. When you look in other developing countries that are not setting record prices, India is a great example of where solar is outcompeting coal. There were thousands of megawatts of coal plants that were canceled just within the last year, and a number of large solar plants that were signed on because it's coming in under 6 US cents a kilowatt hour, and that's now competitive with fossil fuels. This is extremely important because in addition to the existing and additional anticipated price drops for renewables on the global scale, we're starting to see a rise in some of the costs associated with other projects. As Brian and Rich mentioned earlier, many of the new hydropower projects in Laos and potentially in Cambodia as well that are currently in the pipeline in the pre-feasibility study phase, when the feasibility studies are done, those come in too expensive to be a good investment. We've heard from a couple that they're around 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour. If you have solar available within the next few years at 6 cents a kilowatt hour, then some of the most damaging dams really don't make sense when you look at the economic calculus for building them. And for coal projects, which is a mainstay for many of the countries when you're looking at the future energy plans, particularly Vietnam, it's extremely important to remember that the coal price is likely to increase because of rising environmental standards and climate change concerns. And this is not because of a carbon tax, this is because of the need to include scrubbing and other mitigation in new plants. So we've heard from experts in Vietnam that currently the price for coal is around 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. By mid-2020s, that's likely to rise around 9 cents to around 9 cents a kilowatt hour, just because of needing to meet these domestic environmental standards and avoid issues over air pollution. And so at the same time that renewables are becoming more competitive, traditional sources are becoming less competitive. And one major point to look at is why these prices dropped. So certainly a great portion of this was due to overcapacity and economy of scale and solar panel production and wind technology production in China. But two key factors that have not yet reached the Mekong region, but will as more case studies from other countries are available, are government policy shifts and economic financing shifts that make these projects more available. So for instance, basic changes to permitting for land, to net metering, feed-in tariffs for some countries, and other basic policy changes, reducing the tax on these imported technologies, can help drop the price. Equally important is that project financing is increasingly available for renewable electricity technologies. When we talk to people, energy planners in the region, many of them say, it's too expensive, we don't think we can get the money for the project. Both of these things are changing, but the challenge is that they're these aren't so new, these changes are so recent that policy planners have not yet been able to take them into account. So as policy planners continue annual, biannual revisions of their policies and their energy plans, it's extremely important that these shifts are taken into account because, as Brian mentioned before, when you're building a new hydropower plant, it's not going to be available to produce electricity for 7 to 10 years. Coal plants take time to construct. If you have 10 years between when you start a project and when it comes online, you want to be sure it's going to be competitive 10 years down the road. More importantly, you want to be able to know that you'll make a profit off it for many years after, because it takes time to make a profit off these projects. And when you build a coal plant, it's generally planned to be operational for 30, 40, maybe even 50 years, and the same for a hydropower plant. So if you're building projects that are no longer going to be competitive, you're going to have stranded assets, you're going to have challenges for the investors. It just makes more sense to do comprehensive planning here. And the third trend that Brian had touched upon earlier, which I will only briefly go through since we've talked about it in great detail in many of our previous publications, is just the environmental movement as a factor in mainland Southeast Asia. Protests against unpopular coal and hydropower plants have become far more common in recent years than they used to be, with the potential exception of Thailand, which had many of them in the 90s when they were building hydropower. And this has influenced policy directly. Brian and Rich both mentioned the Myat Son Dam in Myanmar, the Krabi coal plant in Thailand. I'll add the Stung Che Orang Dam in Cambodia. All of these projects were suspended because they came into significant public opposition, and in some cases, opposition party support for the protests against these projects. Environmental issues are important to people, especially as more and more evidence comes out that air pollution can impact your health, as there are many, many case studies and more information is now publicly available through social media about the downsides and the negative impacts of relocation on people. So public protests are very common, they're easier to organize, and people have a lot more information at their fingertips when they're talking about their concerns. So as a result, in democracies and in countries where these protests are visible and public, this has influenced policy, not only for specific projects, but also for overall environmental laws. We've seen updates in recent years to the environmental impact assessments. Cambodia is currently working on an EIA law as well as a broader environmental code that touches on green financing, conservation, sustainable energy, and a broad range of environmental issues. Vietnam is likely to update its EIA within the next year or two. Myanmar is working through the process of establishing guidelines and EIAs as they are with many other laws. There are changes afoot in this arena, and most of them are, at least on paper, for the better. So certainly while implementation will take some time, capacity building among the monitoring community will take some time, these changes are positive, and they're a sign that people are more seriously taking environmental issues as a problem, or that they need to address. And finally, I'll just briefly touch on the fact that climate change is also increasingly important. For people in Southeast Asia, when we talk to people, whether they're farmers, fishermen, others, they talk about the differences that they're seeing in the weather from when they were children. Many of them see drought, they see flood, they see climate change as something tangible. And so there isn't the same political issue over whether or not climate change is real here. You don't really see that in countries in Southeast Asia. And so pressure that used to come almost entirely from the international community to consider climate change, to consider carbon emissions, air pollution, much of this has now become maybe not the main political issue in these countries, but certainly a factor in politics. So this is only likely to increase moving forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Brian to talk about power trade.
I'll move through this very quickly. And just to touch on some of the emerging trends that are coming together for power trade within the region. The GMS program, the Greater Mekong Subregion program, which came out of the Asian Development Bank, has long had a plan for power trading within the Mekong region and within all the countries of the Mekong. This is something that has been caught up in policy discussions because countries aren't really willing to share their grids with other countries. And there are other legal and harmonizing challenges to tariffs. But a lot of this is getting worked out. And some of the momentum is coming from the ASEAN side, from the ASEAN Center for Energy. There is this map shows 3 subregions within ASEAN, which are required, using ASEAN, the ASEAN way. Required means maybe it will happen. By 2018, to have multilateral power trade agreements set in stone. And one has just been finalized. And that is one that's led by Laos to sell power to Singapore. And just recently, Thailand has figured out how to bring the power in from Laos and sell it to Malaysia. We're still working on getting it to Singapore, but this is coming through. So it's within ASEAN, the Mekong region is actually leading the way for multilateral power trade. And then China's AIIB is also talking about power trade, particularly from China, getting some of that excess power capacity out of Yunnan province and into mainland Southeast Asia, and using, this high voltage transmission technology that is coming online, as well as a decentralized system of energy distribution. So a new power trade paradigm, is one that I feel and that we feel should be purposed towards these outcomes. One is dropping that energy reserve that is high in both Vietnam and Thailand. If power can be traded, if flexibility can be introduced in a way that matches these areas of high power production to high power need across longer distances, then say Thailand can bring that 40% energy reserve down. And overall, the region will benefit from this in many ways, with the need for fewer dams and fewer coal plants. So I have to lean forward a bit to see this. Having reasonable and strategically thought out power trade throughout the region will also levelize the cost of energy. So the price of solar might be high in, say, Vietnam, but if Cambodia were to specialize in solar production and take advantage of, let's say, some of these stranded economic land concessions that exist and build solar farms on there, Cambodia could transform itself into the solar belt of Southeast Asia.
Did I say that we're getting into probably the most controversial aspect of our proposal, and we're likely to get a lot of questions on it. So
Sure. We'll be wrapping up.
Okay.
We'll be wrapping. Thanks, Rich. Thanks. Then we don't have to lean forward. And I think that through promoting, as Courtney was talking about, within the power trade paradigm, the inclusion of more solar, wind, non-hydro renewables, this is a way to drop the overall GMS carbon footprint and replacing renewables with coal plants and building flexibility then for the future. Because, again, what we're saying that things are changing. This power sector and the energy generation industries and consumption themselves are changing. The changes that we're seeing here in the United States and the West will be introduced in Southeast Asia sooner or later. So it's important for power planners now to think about these emerging trends and to put them into their considerations. In our report, we talk about some of the strategic and security implications to a new paradigm in power trade, and I've listed them out here. I won't go into them, but there are ways we feel that there's win-win-win situations here for all the countries if they can, again, take advantage of these emerging power trends. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, thank you, everybody. My name is Vikram Sequeira, and I cover mainland Southeast Asia for the State Department's Energy Bureau. I'm very excited to be here at the Simpson Center today to see familiar faces and meet some new people as well. So I also want to thank Courtney, Brian, and Rich for inviting me here, and congratulate you all on the publication of the Letters from the Mekong, the newest version. And I thought it was excellent and very well in depth. So I thought I'd just start with giving some background on the State Department's Energy Bureau, and then speak a little bit about the energy situation in the lower Mekong countries, and then survey some of our recent engagement on this issue. The Energy Bureau serves as the principal advisor to the Secretary of State on energy security strategy, energy policy, operations, and energy programs. So what does that mean? We assist countries in creating fair and viable energy sectors that can attract investment and serve as new markets for U.S. exports, services, and technology. And we also help countries meet their energy goals. So that could be diversification of sources. That could be energy transformation. So as you mentioned before, as countries are thinking about moving from hydro to another source or from coal to another source. And as part of the Department of State, we leverage energy to meet our diplomatic goals. So what that means is using energy cooperation as a way to improve the U.S.'s relationship with these countries. To do all this, we work closely with other bureaus in the Department of State, like the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and other agencies like the Department of Energy, USAID, USCDA, Treasury, et cetera. So I'll speak a little bit about how we view the Greater Mekong countries vis-a-vis energy. I think what stands out here, if you take the 30,000-foot view, is the rapidly rising rate of energy consumption in the region as a whole. And of course, there are some countries like Vietnam that have higher rates than others, but on average, energy consumption in Southeast Asian countries will grow between 5 to 10% per year within the next decade or so. And economic growth has propelled this. As you know, I'm sure all of you have studied or know, as countries get wealthier, factories are producing more output, and consumers are purchasing more appliances, using air conditioning more, et cetera, and all this is raising the demand for power. So as the countries of this region are seeking to continue along this high-growth development path, expanding the power sector to keep pace with this will remain a challenge for all of these countries individually and as a region as a whole. So I think it's a critical and it's exciting time to engage with these countries. The Greater Mekong Subregion countries are making long-term, very important decisions right now on how to fuel their economic growth, increase their energy security, minimize harmful effects. And as you mentioned, Brian, for example, building a hydro project will have take 7 to 10 years, and coal often, even if it's forecast for a 30-year period of the plant functioning, it can often go on for longer. So the choices that these countries make right now are very crucial. And I think because of the time period that we find ourselves in, it's been really exciting for me to work on with these countries and with groups like Simpson Center. The Energy Bureau and the U.S. government we're continuing to prioritize this region, and we've engaged both bilaterally and multilaterally to create win-wins, as you mentioned, that benefit the different countries, the region, and the United States. I'll give some quick illustrative examples of some of this engagement in the 5 different countries. In Burma, we're helping the government transparently manage revenue from natural gas sales, which is the largest source of government income. Just in December of last year and March of this year, with the Department of the Treasury, we ran 2 workshops in which experts from both state and Treasury described best practices in how to regulate revenues from sales of natural gas and oil, for Burmese officials working on this. And, gains here really do make a difference, especially if you consider that energy does drive the Burmese economy, and the country has a 34% electrification rate. We hope by this, to go back to what I was saying earlier about the diplomatic goals, that this type of energy engagement, helps to increase ordinary citizens' trust in the democratic transition, as it also helps to develop the country's energy sector. In Laos, we work to strengthen energy access, promote environmental stewardship, improve trust, and try to benefit a U.S. company. So one example of that is working to facilitate the sale of state-of-the-art GE turbines to be used in hydropower construction projects, and this was in 2015 with the Lao government. And we worked closely with the DOE, Department of Energy, not just on this project, but in our Lao engagement as a whole. And my colleague Jamie over here, he can speak to you if anyone has further questions on this. But, in that, we have shown sort of how to use technology like fish-friendly turbines and low salinity dam construction. We've also worked with Cambodia in helping to expand electricity production and enhance grid stability. In 2015, we brought utility commissioners from 5 U.S. states to Phnom Penh, where they taught best practices to Cambodian officials on forecasting future power loads and how to best operate the grid in a manner that is stable over the long term. Cambodia does need a stable grid to attract FDI, and this is also a way in which we can, have a good and close relationship with Cambodia. Vietnam is a big story, and I know that Courtney, you sort of mentioned how big of a case it is just in terms of the volume of what we're dealing with here, and we also view Vietnam as a very crucial country, not just in the region but in the globe, and Vietnam is going through a massive energy transition. Without massive investments in their power sector, there will be energy shortages within the next decade or so. And the Vietnamese government knows this and is currently in a big debate on how to proceed. They're considering building a lot of coal-fired power plants or importing electricity, betting big on natural gas, increased renewable usage, energy efficiency plans, et cetera. And we've worked closely with Embassy Hanoi to help Vietnam meet their energy needs and diversify their sources of energy. The president will visit Da Nang in November for the APEC ministerial, and energy will be a big part of these discussions. Some of you might have seen that when Vietnam's prime minister visited Washington in late May, there were a lot of deals signed specifically regarding energy. There's a $2 billion deal. Or in total, it was $2 billion. One deal, for example, is worth $700 million for constructing gas-fired power plants, and GE was a big part of that. And GE also has over $1 billion agreement to develop an 800-megawatt wind farm in southern Vietnam, which would be the largest wind farm in the country. Finally, to Thailand, we have a long-standing productive energy relationship with Thailand. Along with the Thais, we coordinate the Lower Mekong Initiative's energy security pillar. And in that, we have worked to both bilaterally in terms of energy efficiency programs, best practices, but also multilaterally in increasing energy efficiency in the region. Energy efficiency is scalable, and it's one of the best ways to decrease power usage and save money for a country. I'll just skip over one. So basically, with all the countries, both bilaterally and multilaterally, we're having these conversations. The work that I mentioned are just examples of what we've been doing. Right now on energy efficiency, we're also trying to think sort of bigger and how can we create these win-wins. We've talked about minimum energy performance standards. Again, this is just the beginning of these conversations, but what that is a bottom standard that we have in the United States. Department of Energy runs this, and that basically means that a particular appliance has to have a particular level of efficiency, a minimum standard. And then on the other hand, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Energy Star programs and the stickers you'll find on appliances like refrigerators. This is a voluntary program that rewards the most efficient appliances, and it's really saved a lot of money and made quite a difference in the United States for the economy and for energy efficiency writ large. I bring that up because we're sort of thinking about how to work with ASEAN, LMI, standardization. These are all what we're thinking about in terms of future engagement. And of course, how can we simultaneously help these countries meet their needs, also provide opportunities for U.S. companies, and work with ASEAN as an institution and the Lower Mekong Initiative. So we're going to have high-level participation at the Lower Mekong Initiative Ministerial, which will take place in the Philippines this August, and we'll have a regional working group shortly after that to hammer out the logistical details of U.S. energy engagement. And in short, we're building off of the work we've already done and will continue to do in this region, basically to promote energy security, increase diversification of energy sources, and provide opportunities for U.S. companies. So that's all. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Vikram. I think we've gotten a full load of issues and information and issues to talk about, and including Vikram, I appreciate you bringing in the role that the U.S. is playing in the region via the Lower Mekong Initiative. I'm sure you don't have the answer to what the future funding for these programs is, given the current climate. So I won't tax you with that. I have actually a couple, I think, really important questions that should be addressed, but I'm going to forego my raising them, and let's see what comes out of the audience. And if I feel like there's something that really needs to be addressed, I'll leave a few minutes left at the end. So The floor is open. You're first, yes. No, here, up in front. Yeah.
So, hello? Hello?
Oh, by the way, please give your name and affiliation, and keep it as much as you can to a question rather than...
Hello, my name is Panya. I'm from Voice of America, Khmer Service.
We're not hearing you, sorry.
Okay. My name is Panya. I'm from Voice of America, Khmer Service. Yeah, I got 3 questions for Brian and 3 questions for Courtney. So first question for Brian. In simple terms, how can the lower Mekong countries fundamentally work together when it comes to energy shift itself? And second, will there be possible case of conflicts? If so, what are they? And third question, what are the possible mechanisms, if there are any for now, to resolve conflicts for the stakeholders? And questions for Courtney. How much better, more efficient, more distributive is the energy sector, the new energy sector? And who are the other stakeholders besides the government? And how can transparency be ensured? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. How can Mekong countries work together to deliver this future? We have been working on, and we see an opportunity for Vietnam to play a catalytic role in shaping, 1, how this transition is ushered in, and 2, how the rest of the basin is built out in terms of hydropower development. And a lot of it comes from an imbalance that exists between power purchases from Vietnam to Laos and power purchases from Thailand to Laos. Thailand has agreements for about 9,000 megawatts of power for import from Laos into Thailand. Vietnam is at 5,000, but only about 1,000 of that has been planned out with actual power purchase agreements. Vietnam to date has been in a very passive and kind of opposition mode to damming on the Mekong. And this hasn't borne any fruit for Vietnam, and it's only kind of created more conflict. So Vietnam can engage. Vietnam kind of has a choice of importing power from its neighbors or importing coal from Indonesia and the rest of the world. Coal would be polluting if it's done too much. Power from neighbors would be damaging to the delta if it's done in a way that's not thought out correctly. But if Vietnam were to think strategically about which assets it wants to invest in abroad, because it can't get it out of its own territory. The power is just not there. And invest more robustly in its neighborhood in a way that's win-win, okay? Increasing economic transactions of power purchase between countries, investing in actual assets like dams, solar farms, etc. This is a way that Vietnam can meet its energy demand and unlock a lot of economic development potential. So within this, the conflict then arises, how does Thailand react, or how does Myanmar react? And it can kind of build a race to the top, I think, in terms of thinking sustainably and strategically about future energy sector build-out. Conflict, well, let's start thinking about a blueprint that has a low level of risk and a low level of conflict built into it, of a basin-wide strategy, so that you can get there more quickly, reduce delays, and then conflicts. I'm kind of thinking too far in the future here, but if the setting is one that is built on trust and economic development rather than strategy and diplomacy, then I think we're already talking about a much more conflict reduced landscape.
Brian, just a technical question related to this, and that is that we came around to the idea of allow National Electric Power Grid in part, apart from its benefits, but in part because that's a bilateral issue between a donor and the government of Laos. And clarify, if you would, would these relationships you're talking about be primarily bilaterals, or are we talking multilateral?
Essentially, it's looking at power purchasing agreements
Okay.
between Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, and maybe Cambodia and Laos as well, that are conditional. So the bilateral mechanism is a way to get there. So you're conditionally saying, we would like to purchase power from these sources and not that, and we're willing to invest in these sources.
Courtney, you had questions to respond to.
Yep. So I'll try to answer your questions actually in the order that they came. So the first sounded like about what the main differences and improvements would be between sort of a more modern grid and energy structure versus the more traditional model. And I think the first important thing to touch on that we didn't actually talk as much about in the discussion is the emergence of distributed grid technology. For many of the countries that we're profiling here, a lot of the electricity build out for the infrastructure is transmission lines to bring rural areas into the grid, areas that currently have either just local diesel generator access or no access to electricity. Another major factor in the grid and electricity sector build-out is the long-distance transmission lines, point-to-point transmission from a hydropower project in Sông Trăng to Phnom Penh. These will likely have to happen. If you look at the distribution of electricity in Southeast Asia, in most countries, very significant portions of it are in urban areas. So Bangkok is about 40% of Thailand's total electricity generation. There will have to be some continuance of this point-to-point transmission. As Brian discussed, there are opportunities for improvements in efficiency there. But the real game changer is actually going to be the distributed generation. And this is particularly important for countries that are looking to introduce renewable solar and wind. There are a lot of opportunities, for instance, for rooftop solar. That's one of the big areas in Thailand energy policy that has not yet been unlocked. And a lot of this has to do with permitting. Currently, it's not possible or not allowed in many countries in the region to build your own power generation and then input it into the grid. There's no net metering available. There's no way to track what you're doing. In a couple countries, it's actually illegal. So we've heard of people who've put solar panels in Cambodia because it's cheaper than buying electricity from the grid, and were then contacted by the utilities company and told, if you keep operating these, we're going to cut you off from the grid. You're not going to be able to access electricity through us because it's illegal.
Was that the U.S. Embassy?
The U.S. Embassy did add solar panels. They did not get threatened, but I know of individual families that have. But the U.S. Embassy is a case in point. They wanted to add solar panels in Phnom Penh, and they are doing so, but it took some negotiation, and they actually offered, I believe, to do capacity building and have discussions with the utilities company, Electricity de Cambodge, about how to do net metering and use the embassy as a case study, and those talks came to naught. So there are going to have to be a lot of policy changes. And in the long run, this will likely lead to more efficiency. You'll be able to have local generation. And for rural areas, this may mean instead of investing in extremely expensive transmission infrastructure that you could have a rural grid in a distributed area, down the road, perhaps it could be integrated into a national grid, but it could eliminate some of the need for that. So there's a lot of changes that will have to happen in the utility sector that may be disruptive in the short term, but in the long term, they will likely lead to a much more flexible and resilient system. Your second question was about stakeholders. Certainly when we're talking about energy planning here in our energy profiles, most of the planning references were from the government. Obviously, the private sector is a key stakeholder here, particularly for Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar, because much of the investment for energy projects and energy infrastructure is going to be coming from outside. But certainly one of the most important stakeholder groups that has often been left out of the conversation are the people who are paying for electricity. Certainly some of this electricity transmission and production build-out is for the industrial sector, but much of it is also for rising living standards for the consumers. So the consumers, do they care what type of electricity they purchase? And equally, if not more importantly, the people who are directly affected by projects, particularly large infrastructure projects like hydropower. Solar panels can also do this because a large commercial plant uses a lot of land. Talking to the people who are going to be relocated for these projects has been a consistent issue throughout the region and globally. So that's a challenge for countries, is bringing these stakeholders in, particularly when so many of them have been disappointed by past case studies. Certainly there are examples of good projects. And this is clearly tied to transparency. And unfortunately, transparency and addressing corruption's been a commonly commented upon issue in this region. And I don't think there's anyone that has a clear answer for how to improve it in one go. Probably for the energy sector in particular, a couple of the key changes would be to have competitive bidding for projects. That opens up the opportunity for more outside analysis of what happens with individual projects, so you don't have someone having their friend do a project behind the scenes when you've got an open and competitive bidding process. Probably the other major trend, which we are seeing some improvements for, is raising environmental and social and health impact assessment standards for these projects, and then ensuring that those are publicly available or go through some sort of public consultation process, which we've seen a little bit through Mekong River Commission, and we've seen improvements in the laws in some of these countries that would make that more possible. So overall, those are some of the immediate things that come to mind when it comes to transparency.
Thank you. There was one third one, but yeah, okay, you covered it. That's great. In the back? Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Ken Conca, American University. Thanks, really great briefing, learned a lot. So one of the things about energy markets is that they're heavily intervened in and distorted, and as a lot of your examples have shown, the policy framework is critical to what the shadow price actually is, right? So if I heard you correctly, a tighter air quality regime basically almost doubles the price of coal effectively, and that's obviously hugely consequential. So the policy framework that's starting to stand up a renewables and conservation sector is critically important. And the policy framework that makes the price of coal more accurate from a net social benefits point of view is critically important. There's another policy framework that you didn't speak to, which is the framework that is making uncompetitive, economically uncompetitive large hydro remain competitive, right? So it's the loan guarantees, and it's the power purchase agreements, and it's all the ways that the state or regional actors kind of mitigate risk, especially for private investors who might otherwise be scared away by the uncertainty. So the question is it enough to get a positive enabling environment, a policy framework that stands up a renewable sector and that gives us the true cost of coal to make this transformative shift that you're talking about? Or does it also require sorting out the disabling environment that's keeping many uncompetitive? Because if you do a good net social benefit study now that as your work has shown very clearly, price the environment, price the uncertainty, price the value of flexibility, which I think you spoke to very well, you can show that a lot of these big hydro projects are losers already. Yeah. So, and so what is it that's keeping them afloat? So what can we hope for or look toward in that part of the policy framework that's so consequential in the shadow prices of these energy markets?
Could I inject into this question one of the factors that you haven't actually mentioned explicitly, but when you talk about coal, you're talking about people locally suffering from the dirt that's coming out of the stack. And I grew up in Pittsburgh. I remember when you had darkness at noon, you know. Good. Okay. Thank you. But the hydro, for instance, is downstream, and a country like Laos with lots of hydro potential, relatively lightly populated, and most of the impact, in fact, it's been documented that many times the impact will be felt downstream, economic and environmental, from what happens in Laos. So the two different. Where public opinion can get really involved with a dirty coal plant, but hydro is a tougher nut to crack, right?
So to start on this answer, I think Courtney has some contribution as well. Think about mainstream dams on the lower Mekong. If China cannot promise a regular flow, particularly during the dry season, then these dams really don't look to be commercially viable in the future. And to date, there's never been evidence from China's dams of any type of regulation during the dry season. You know, the powers that be in this process are China's trade fleet making a call from the Golden Triangle saying the water level's too low. We can't get back up to China to get the goods to market. Let water out of the dams. This is one of the ways that water gets out of the dams. Other factors are releasing water from dams to to get ready for flood season, or to prepare for seismic shock. And in 2008, China released most of the water from its Yunnan dams, and it shocked the downstream after an earthquake hit. So there's so many factors that prevent this type of regulation of the lower downstream, but the dams are still going up. And I posed this question to a good friend in China. The next big dam on the Mekong is the Pakbang Dam, and it's the closest to China. It's in Laos. It's the closest to the Golden Triangle, and it's being built by a Chinese developer. With all this in mind, how is China going to make money off of this? How is the developer, Datang, going to make money off of this dam? Well, it might take longer to make the profits back. That was one of the answers. But the other answer was that these companies are looking to increase their shareholder value. So demonstrating that more projects are in the pipeline, that things are going forward, just the announcement of a dam is a way to attract investment, buying of its shares from Southeast Asia. So they can make their money back in 2 to 3 years just through that process and not really care about the commercial viability of the project itself. And so this is one of the things that's driving the process forward, particularly on the mainstream.
Brian touched on a number of the comments that I was going to make, but I think one thing to keep in mind is that while the developers may be able to make their money back, it's important to keep in mind that these projects are supported by and approved by the governments, which anticipate being able to make a profit back from them down the road when they're handed over in 20 to 30 years, which anticipate having the capacity to manage. And this is particularly true for Laos, where almost all of the projects are outside investment under a build, own, operate, transfer model, where the company owns it, makes a profit off it, runs it for 20 or 30 years, and then transfers ownership over to Laos. And I think there is rising sentiment in a number of countries in Southeast Asia that some of these projects are actually bad deals. Because, as you commented on, the externalities, those are not borne by the company. They're borne by the country, or in the case of mainstream Mekong dams or some of the tributary dams, they're borne by downstream countries. So Vietnam, I think, is very aware of this. There have been numerous discussions, I think, in the MRC, the Mekong River Commission, but also probably behind closed doors about how to try and bring externalities more into the conversation. And when you're just looking at an individual dam project, when you're just saying don't build the dam project, it can be very difficult because that's not addressing the concerns of the people who want the dam project to move forward. But that is one of the reasons that we think that the power trade opportunity here, particularly for Vietnam, but also for Thailand, if they were, for instance, to consider when signing power purchase agreements with neighboring countries, the sustainability side of things, if they were to consider the carbon emissions from projects, which is maybe more the case for coal, although there's increasing evidence that large hydropower has significant carbon emissions. This could potentially lead to negotiated outcomes where governments and developers would still be able to make profits, but off of better projects. So I guess the long answer, or the short answer, is, of course, that there are a lot of things that are behind the visibility of scholars and decisions that are made in a non-transparent manner about why projects move forward that can't be changed. But we try to identify areas we can.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Jamie.
Thank you. Jamie Kern, U.S. Department of Energy, Office of International Affairs. I cover Southeast Asia with these wonderful people here. I have one question for all of you, and that is the Mekong River Commission. How does, for Stimson's explanation of the decreasing competitiveness of hydro and increasing competitiveness of solar and wind, for State Department's Lower Mekong Initiative and assisting these countries with their goals, how does the Mekong River Commission fit into these plans, and how do you, if at all, and then how do you go about that?
Two points. We need to convince the Mekong River Commission to take a broader look at energy and not just focus on hydropower. There are those out there that think about the Mekong River Commission as a think tank. Well, then there's space to think more broadly about what's happening. The current Mekong Agreement, really, it talks about sustainable development of the river. So we're looking at water resource management and the use of water resources. But really what we're talking about is the intersection of water and energy. So if the MRC were to promote broader thinking about how you can place some hydropower dams with solar farms and what it would take to get there, and provide some of the policy advice for making that happen. That would be a step in the right direction. The second is that this would be much more difficult because it would require tweaking the Mekong Agreement, which is probably a non-starter. That's the 1995 law that the Mekong River Commission has promulgated from. It dictates that the countries are only required to announce projects, so that's hydropower projects or irrigation projects that affect the mainstream, or tributaries within a very close proximity of the mainstream. But the idea that we're trying to get out here is that it's about the basin at large. You know, it's not about Laos' 9 mainstream dams. It's about Laos' 140 dams for the whole basin, and that's what's going to impact the Mekong Delta. That's what's going to impact Cambodia. So if the Mekong River Commission could broaden its scope to think more broadly about the basin and require countries to announce, you don't have to announce every dam, but let's say large dams, dams over 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts, and those dams are more scrutinized. Without that, the result will be what's happening now. You know, there are 7 dams being built by Power China, China's largest dam builder, on the Nam U Cascade in northern Laos. 7 dams on one of the most important tributaries of the river. Have you heard about that? No. A lot of people that follow the Mekong don't know about this because it's not transparent and it's not part of the Mekong River Commission's scope of work.
Yeah, could you address also, though, the issue that the MRC has had lots of technical capacity, but donors have gotten jaded about financing the MRC, and of course the 4 member governments, their national Mekong committees generally are not very important to total government policy, and they've not really invested much in cooperative effort, because I think that goes again to where we've been talking a way around the MRC, not very useful role that they could play, important role that they could play, but there's a kind of a dilemma, isn't there, with the countries and the donors. Anything else? Go ahead, please.
Good evening. My name is Watana from the Voice of America Cambodian Service. I have a specific question to Vikram. Is the Lower Mekong Initiative currently active in Cambodia, and what were the achievements specifically to Cambodian and people around the Mekong River? That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. What was the second part? The first part was, is the Lower Mekong Initiative active in Cambodia? Yeah. And what was the second part?
What were the achievements that Mekong and Lower Mekong Initiative took from the people?
Sure. Okay. Thanks. So the LMI is active in Cambodia, and some of the work I described before in terms of working on load forecasting was co-funded by LMI and then the Energy Bureau. So we have worked pretty closely on a technical level with LMI. That means, Electricité du Cambodge, for example, in the Ministry of Energy. But yeah, it's been technical, and that includes both the assistance on the forecasting, also bringing Cambodian officials to the United States on sort of reverse study tours to look at how it's done here. With some of that work, we've worked with an organization called NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory and Utility Commissioners, and we've had utility and regulator officials from utilities and regulators from different U.S. states, and we've tried to pick the states that have more similarities with the way in which EDC runs its grid, work with the Cambodians. So, some of this work is ongoing, but I don't know if that answers the question. But the idea is to help with grid stability, and with that increased FDI. So, okay, you're welcome.
All right, we're almost finished.
I'm Su Hao from China Professor University at Beijing. Thanks. Brian invited me to attend this policy report launch. And I remember some years ago, I was here to have discussion with Richard regarding the Lower Mekong project. But it seems to me that this report is focused on the Mekong River in general, right, regarding the power shift. So I would say that in the past, China is not part of that, just focus on the Lower Mekong, right? But now you already have China included, right? So I think it's pleased to know that, notice that changeables the patterns of your analysis. And my question to you is that regarding the multilateral management over the Mekong rivers, not only the energy but also the economic cooperation. Of course, energy is one of the important issues for that. So that will be the name called the Lam-Mei mechanism, cooperative mechanism, right? Yeah, but it seemed that in your report it did not mention about this, right? So I'm wondering, what's your assessment about the kind of multilateral mechanism of Lam-Mei cooperation?
Right, the LMCM. We're still learning more about China's LMCM mechanism, the LMC mechanism, and I think there's still a lot to be said about what the LMC will be. I believe in August or early September, there's going to be a summit of sorts in Siem Reap where the countries of the Mekong will get together to kind of figure out and plot out the future. Our read of the LMC is that it's a little bit too comprehensive. And I can be critical of the LMI as well, because we're water and energy kind of hacks here. We want to make sure that water and energy get put to the fore and the impacts of water and energy development to a broad range of stakeholders and communities within the region. It's an interesting response. I think that if the LMC is a reaction, if you will, to the U.S. LMI, then I think this is actually a win, a strategic win for the LMI, because it's a program that is multilateral in orientation. And it's caused China to think about perhaps there is also a multilateral way to go about this and engage. And I'm not talking down the LMI, but China is bringing a lot more resources to the LMC than what the LMI can. There's a $10 billion line of credit that comes with the LMC. What that will be used for? Is it for data sharing and data management on water issues and thinking about how dams and energy projects could be better coordinated? Or will it be plowed into high-speed rails or road building or stadiums, for that matter? That's left to be said. And our hope is certainly for the former, that it is one that thinks about integrated water and energy planning within the region.
I'd like to weigh in briefly on that as well, and that is that there is a big asymmetry and between what China is doing and the U.S. is doing, starting, of course, with the scale of the money we're both putting into this region. But before this last summit that was held on Hainan Island, a year ago, roughly? A little more than that. Right before that meeting, there was a high-level statement from the Chinese Commerce Ministry. And it's quite bold in terms of it almost said, okay, yeah, we're going to include the river in this mechanism, but really, you guys, you need to forget about the river. Here we're offering $10 billion to promote industrialization and to integrate, let your economy become integrated in the Chinese economy. And basically, as I said, he said, the minister in his statement was this is old hat. This is not what the future is. And the other problem is that so far, as Brian has mentioned, the issue of data sharing and the downstream countries, apart from when there's a flood season event, they have no information on the operation of China's dams. And so that's something that would have to change if China really wants to work on the kind of issues that the LMI is working on. Thank you. Well, I guess I had the last word. It wasn't planned that way, but I think we certainly addressed all the questions. And I have sort of one final question. I'll just throw it out without necessarily an answer right now. But it's just that, I want to know more, particularly about the role of China, but also the whole power sharing thing. If it's an indication of where you're going now, I mean, what's the next focus of within the framework of this report?
Sure. I mean, if I can add with a quick end to that,
yeah.
It's figuring out and having, like we said, we think that this excess power issue, China's southern grid is looking for ways to get it into Southeast Asia. And China could take its typical excess capacity mercantilistic approach, like offboarding steel and labor abroad, and messing up local markets and making a political and environmental mess of the thing. But there's another way to turn this around, and that is to say that here is a chance for China to demonstrate its ability to be a responsible stakeholder, to temporarily, maybe not long term, but temporarily send power into Southeast Asia to provide for that pause. It would take a grand build-out in transmission, but a lot of that transmission needs to be built anyway. And this would reduce the need for the build-out of dams and coal fire plants so that these other renewable energy sources could be built into the system.
Okay, that is the last word. Thank you all very much. And particularly, you've already given a hand to our panelists. It was an excellent presentation all around, and we look forward to the next phase, the next stage. Thank you all. Vikram, thanks very much.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
That was a good compliment to the...
I was happy that you were doing it. Yeah.